everyone. Thank you, Millie, and welcome to today's webinar. So I'm Rebecca Mottram and I'm part of the performance assurance team in the REC Co-Manager, and I'm also joined today by a number of my colleagues, so I'll be introducing them shortly. So the focus of today's webinar is split into two parts. So the first being to cover off an update on CSS readiness arrangements, and specifically what's changing in our REC performance assurance service as we approach REC version 3. So we'll start off this first section with Christina introducing some changes to the retail risk register. So I hope you're all aware that we have recently done a consultation on this. We're then going to move on to Andrew giving you some updates in terms of our performance assurance report catalogue and also some changes to our monitoring approach. Georgina will then talk you through some updates in terms of our market entry process and what's going to be going on post CSS Go Live. And then finally, but no means least, Eliana will be talking you through some new REC Performance Assurance Board PAB responsibilities. We'll conclude that first section then with the Q&A. So as Millie said, please do use Slido, but if you're having issues accessing that, then you can also use the chat function here. There'll also be an opportunity during the Q&A section where you can raise your hand. So if you want to speak and raise your question verbally, then please do as well. The second part of the session will then move on to looking at the retail risk threshold setting. So this is going to be led by Anton, and we're going to talk you through some of the work we're doing at the moment with the REC PAB. So the focus of this session is really to talk you through what our risk threshold methodology is, how the REC Co-Manager is going to be using these thresholds to support our risk monitoring, and also, very importantly, how the risk thresholds impact you as REC parties. We'll again conclude this section with a Q&A session. So again, please use Slido, chat function, or just raise your hand when we get to that. I just wanted to really reiterate as well that the focus of today's session and this webinar is very much focused on REC performance assurance and how our service is going to be evolving. So if you do have any wider questions, particularly in relation to CSS and REC version 3, then we may have to take these questions away and another member of the REC Co-Manager can pick these up offline. So before we move on to the first part of the session, we thought it'd be useful just to spend a few minutes just reminding attendees of the role of the Performance Assurance Co-Manager team, what are our responsibilities at the moment, and then I'll be passing on to my colleagues a bit later on to talk you through how some aspects of our service are going to be evolving. So if we first of all start off, so as I'm sure most of you are already aware, a lot of our responsibilities are highlighted here on the screen. So the REC Performance Assurance team, one of our key roles really is to monitor REC party and REC service provider performance in the retail energy market. So to do this, we have a dynamic risk-based approach and it's supported by our analytics. So this allows us to monitor party and service provider performance. The aim of this approach is really to help drive market performance improvements. So this could be systemic issues in the market, or it could be individual party performance as well. We also look at how well the code arrangements are working, and some of our monitoring and our outcomes of this work may be that we need to improve some of the code arrangements as well. So over the last many months now, we've been working with the REC PAB to not only design but also implement the performance assurance framework. So you'll see a number of our components and projects listed on the right hand side of this slide. So one of these key projects is our retail risk register, which Christina will be talking you through shortly. And really the purpose of this register is really to highlight what are the priority retail risks and risk drivers that we and the PAB monitor and assess based on data that we collect. So we're also responsible for administering the party entry and exit process. And we also have a role in monitoring and undertaking compliance assessments of parties as well as service providers. So if we just move on to the next slide, please. So aside from our core performance assurance activities, we also undertake some wider assurance activities as well, which are highlighted on this slide here. So for example, we administer the metering codes of practice accreditations and audits. We also operate a number of governance processes working with the PAB. So for example, consideration of derogations, sandbox and dispute applications. And also we operate the energy theft arrangement. So for example, monitoring of the theft targets. So I'll pause there. Hopefully that's covered, what I've covered there is quite familiar to you all and is a useful reminder before we move on to the next section. We're now going to move on to the first part of the webinar, which is going to focus on CSS readiness arrangements under the Performance Assurance Service. And Christina and then Andrew will be covering some changes we've made to our risk register and also the park as well. So over to you, Christina.
Thank you. If we move to the next slide, please. So I'm going to be talking about the changes to our risk register and our monitoring approach. So when CSS goes live in the 18th of July, there'll be significant changes to the industry systems and processes. So we've been updating our documents, including the risk register, so that they're aligned to REC version 3. So throughout these evaluation process, we went through all the different schedules and understood what was going to change. And we consolidated some updates to be made, shared these with the PAB, and they've all been involved through the consultation that has taken place. We've recently published the consultation response, so thank you for all of those that participated in the consultation process. In summary, there's been changes to 16 different risk drivers within those 7 retail risks that are listed to the right. But if we move to the next slide, walk you through an overview of what has really changed. So the changes have been mainly around the introduction to CSS. And as part of this, it also covered the introductions of the GS in the service provider assurance work that we do. We've took the opportunity as well to consolidate some of the risk drivers and simplified them, because we got feedback that it could be simplified. There are also some new processes that came into in annulments and withdrawals, and we've also added these to the risk register. And last but not least, we've also changed some of our approach to measuring these risks from data-led to service provider assurance. There's been the link below when we share the slides will take you to the risk register consultation, and you'll be able to see the changes made. But the actual risk register the current version is in the REC portal as well, and the new version will be published soon. I'll pass now to Andrew to go through the park changes.
Thanks, Christina. So morning, everybody. First of all, in terms of park, just in terms of status as a document, I guess. So as has been mentioned before, it's currently a category 3. There's a change proposal going through to move it to a category 2. That change proposal is going through, but we're obviously running the change to the park itself as a category 2 change, of course. The consultation for the change to the park, so not the change of the parks category, but the actual change to the park, that we're going to talk through today. So it's gone through impact assessment, and we've had some comments back from a number of parties. So the impact assessment, thank you for those. And then it'll be going out to consultation, as it says in June. I think it actually starts on the 31st of May, but there's the consultation window. So, you know, everything we're going to talk about here, you'll obviously have a chance to look through if you've not already, and obviously provide comments back through that industry consultation window. So all the changes that we're making, I guess, fall into 3 categories. So there are some changes that are more just about the document itself, or correcting a couple of minor errors in there. There are then the bulk of the changes which are to do with REC 3.0. Most of those, and we'll go on to talk about in a bit more detail in a second, but most of those touch on the sort of the data we need to collect from service providers, particularly obviously CSS, as the processes change and therefore the sources of data change. And then there are also some changes that affect parties, particularly suppliers in the main. Again, we'll talk about them in a little bit more detail. That includes one thing that's driven by REC 3.0. And then we've also included, just to avoid two parallel changes going through, because we thought that'd be confusing, we've also included some adjustments to two other reports, which have been based on feedback we've had from a number of parties, particularly those operating in the non-domestic sector. So what I propose I do is, if we go to the next slide, I'll talk you through those changes. We've got kind of two ways of looking at this, so I'll sort of try not to repeat myself too much, but we'll look at it a little bit by party type, and then we'll also talk about we'll also look at it at a sort of change level overall, just if you want to kind of get that overall feel. So as you can see from the table there, number of different party types impacted. So no impact on networks and DGTs. Gas MEMS, there's one change, which was a basic correction of an incorrect reference. So we wouldn't expect an impact there because I think we'd already clarified that directly with MEMS, but obviously we needed to just correct the reference in the document. For suppliers, there are two changes to highlight. So one is a new data item, which is the data cleanse exception report. So let's say exemption report. So this is for those of you who are already involved in this, and obviously maybe different people from different suppliers on the call that deal with the DWG, but the switching program DWG, so Data Working Group, which has been running over the course of the program, has obviously been looking at data cleanse in readiness for CSS Go Live. Some of the items that they have been monitoring will then transition over to the code manager to monitor in a post CSS world, because there are ongoing data quality issues that will continue to affect switching activity, consumer outcomes in that, and also parties' interactions with each other. So we are effectively taking the specification of those reports in terms of the logic and the business rules that are applied, and we're transitioning those over to become part of the performance assurance activity. The DWG currently allows for parties to claim exemptions against those cleansing rules. So effectively, where the rule says there may be a piece of cleanse work needed here, but actually the DWG and its subcommittee have looked at particular examples and determined that, okay, no, actually there's a reason why something that either doesn't need to or can't be cleansed. So often to do with whether there are available values and appropriate values to use around some of the market domain data. So parties are able to sort of claim those exemptions at the moment, if you like, when their cleanse progress has been tracked. And so obviously what we don't want to do is on day one sort of forget about all of that and everybody sort of suddenly have a big step change in their cleanse lists. So obviously we want to allow parties to continue to feed that back. We are proposing that's provided to us as a list of meter points. The reason for that is twofold. So one is we want to be able to give back to parties, their list of their list of exceptions on the cleanse reports, and so we want to be able to obviously kind of put to one side your exemptions for you, and then the other is to allow us to track over time the aging and the profile of what's being cleansed and what's not, rather than just have a number. We can obviously then sort of track and monitor whether things are actually being getting to a point where yes, there was an exemption, but actually, that exemption might have sort of timed out and we need to look again at it. So for those reasons, we've asked parties to provide us that at a meter point level. Quite a straightforward list of meter points, essentially the meter point, the exception report it forms an exemption for, and the reason. So that's hopefully data people are already using. Obviously, we're just collecting it now through the enduring process. And then the other two changes that affect suppliers are to 1430 and 1440. So these are the gaining and losing supplier switching reports. We've had some feedback and some conversations with parties, as I say, particularly those in non-domestic, who raised a couple of concerns around some of the information from more of a commercial confidentiality point of view, and also who had sort of highlighted a couple of areas where they thought some additional allowed values would allow them to better report on the activities that they're undertaking. So we've made some changes. It's all in the markup if you want to go look at the detail, but effectively there's a new column added to each report. And then there are some additional allowed values for some of the existing columns, as well as some updated guidance on how to use those new columns and those new values. So we'll require a change by suppliers to obviously follow that new format. If you are a domestic supplier only, and you've already got that report built, there's obviously a structural change there, but you clearly don't need to make use of those additional allowed values and additional guidance. It's more to it's more to kind of create that option. But obviously, as I say, all the details in the markup. Carrying on down the list, so across a wide range of service providers, as part of the monitoring of the service of service providers to RECO and to obviously the market, we capture a range of sort of SLA and performance in that sense of monitoring, and we're really sort of consolidating a lot of that into the part. There were some additional items that weren't in the version that went out from impact assessment, because some of this came up through some of the feedback from impact assessment to say actually we want to capture all of these here. So there'll be an updated version of the markup going out into the consultation. No impact on parties from that change, and no real impact on service providers because it's reporting they already either are doing or need to do anyway that they're already aware of. We're just sort of consolidating that into one place. CSS provider obviously did not previously provide us with data, so all of the data that they'll be providing has now gone into the park. That had previously gone through the switching program change process, so obviously familiar. Similarly, SDES provider, there are some new reporting needed, particularly around the schedule there around resolution of consumer-facing switching and billing issues that require certain activities to go through SDES. So there's some new reporting that supports that. And then finally, GS provider, again, similar, sort of picking up some usage and performance things there, as well as tidying up a couple of references and just aligning with some existing bits and pieces. If we just go on to the next slide, I'll go through this one a little bit quicker because it's kind of saying the same thing, but in, if you like, the opposite the opposite sort of angle. So not looking at it at a party level, but just overall what's changing. So didn't really mention the previous slide, but some usability updates, just sort of navigation links, those sorts of things. We've obviously cleared out references to V2 schedules that don't exist and replaced them with the relevant V3 one, and some risk renumbering and those sorts of things. And then the rest of it really is new data items, primarily for central providers, those changes for suppliers, and those couple of other tweaks that we've mentioned. So that's, I guess, a bit of a summary. There may be questions, and we can obviously go through. And so I'm just going to message that saying there might be a question coming up in a second. So we'll pick that one up. But yeah, as I say, if you've not already, please do go take a look. We've tried to do a really detailed markup version because I know that's something people have asked for. So there's red line throughout, and there's a really detailed sheet that calls out every cell that's changed in the version that's available to take a look at. So hopefully that will help you hone in on things that you want to look at. And as I say, the consultation window opens. I'm pretty confident I'm saying it's the 31st, which is next Tuesday, and that'll be open for a couple of weeks. So do get any comments back through that. Obviously, we can cover questions on there as well. I think that was everything I was going to say in terms of part changes. So Christina, is that back to you, or I think is that on to G for market entry?
Yes, it's now moving on to me.
Thanks, G.
So The principles of the market entry process predominantly remain the same, with the main difference being that there's a wider variety of services available, i.e. the gas inquiry service and central switching service. In order to access a REC service, access agreements are required to be signed by non-REC parties. REC parties are not required to do so, as they are able to access REC services as part of their accession to the REC. For non-REC party users requesting access to EES, GES, and/or CSS, there will only be one access agreement signed, which will cover the relevant REC services and any requested reports. In terms of the GES transition, on the go-live date, July 18th, all non-REC party users on services transitioning to GES will have their existing access agreements expire, and these will be replaced with new access agreements with the REC. For all parties in the process of gaining GES access, they will not be permitted access until the go-live date, where they will sign the new access agreement with the REC. And finally, for non-REC parties with access to a service transitioning to GES, whose existing access agreement is expiring prior to the go-live date, an access agreement with the REC will be signed on the date of expiry. Moving on to the next slide. So we've also updated our forms, guidance, and documentation to reflect the new CSS changes. For example, the joint storyboards have been updated to reflect potential CSS scenarios for internal and external testing. The REC service user categorization and assessment document has been updated to include information regarding GES and CSS interface providers. The Business Solution Assessment, BSA, which is required by only REC parties as part of the market entry process, and the Information Security and Data Protection, ISDP questions, which are required by all parties requesting access to REC services, have both been amended, with additional questions being added and a few existing questions being updated. The REC Entry Assessment Information Pack has been updated to provide further information regarding the changes to the ISDP, as well as the external testing entry criteria updates, which I will cover in a later slide. And the REC Maintenance of Qualification Guidance has also been updated to include the updated forms the organisation are required to complete as part of their maintenance of qualification. Please note these forms are not yet available on the REC portal. When the parties can directly access this information on the portal, these embedded forms will be removed from the guidance documents. I think we have a question, but I don't know if we're taking questions at the very end.
Let's do them at the Q&A session.
Perfect. So moving on to the next slide. So what does the CSS onboarding process look like? Well, if an organisation has successfully completed testing in line with the transition schedule, they'll be considered qualified to become a CSS user, and therefore the CSS onboarding process does not apply. However, from the CSS go live date, energy suppliers who are qualified before CSS go live but have not successfully completed testing, they will be required to be qualified under the REC. So they will continue to be qualified under the REC, but will be required to carry out additional steps in order to become a CSS user. In regards to our role as the REC code manager within the CSS onboarding process, we facilitate and support applicants through the entry process. We raise a service request via our service provider's ticketing system to initiate CSS external testing for applicants, and we also raise a service request via the ticketing system to initiate CSS onboarding. So moving on to who is required to become a CSS user. So for REC parties, if you are an energy supplier or electricity retail data agent, you must become a CSS user. Whereas if you are a meter equipment manager, you have the option of becoming a CSS user. For non-REC parties, such as meter asset providers, shippers, or supply agents, you can decide whether to become a CSS user or not. Moving on to the next slide. So the CSS onboarding process is similar to the current market entry process. However, we, i.e. the code manager, will be communicating with the CSS service provider to initiate CSS external testing and onboarding, which was mentioned in the previous slide as part of the role of the REC code manager. An MPID is required to be established before a market entrant can send flows via the DTN. Therefore, the external testing, service requests, and CSS onboarding requests can only be sent when an MPID has been sent up. That means the latest that this can be done is before the external testing starts. Moving on to the next slide. As previously mentioned, non-mandatory parties such as meter assets providers, shippers, or supply agents can decide whether to become a CSS user. If they only want access to EES or GES, they will follow the existing market entry process with no additional requirements. However, if they decide to become a CSS user, they will follow the current market entry process with the addition of being required to complete CSS external testing on top of their ISDP. I believe that's everything from me, so I will now pass on to Eliana, who will cover the new REC PAB responsibilities.
That's great, thank you, G. If we just go on to this slide. So I'm just going to walk you through this really simple slide on any new REC PAB responsibilities from CSS Go Live. So the first point to kind of draw out is that there are a number of responsibilities that will not have changed and will continue as they do at the moment after CSS Go Live. So we've listed some of those on the screen here. So I won't go through all of them, but it's things like the management of retail risks that Christina talked you through earlier. So the PAB will still have oversight for monitoring those retail risks and taking any action in terms of applying performance assurance techniques. They'll still have oversight of the market entry process, including metering accreditation. And there'll be other things that we've mentioned already, such as sandbox and derogation applications, and also appeals and escalations. So the things that are listed out on the bottom of the screen are kind of two further responsibilities that will be in place from CSS Go Live. So the first one that we've listed there is additional service provider assurance, and that will cover CSS related service providers. So it's things like the Central Services Switching Provider, DCC, the CSS Certification Authority, the Gas Inquiry Service, the Gas Retail Data Service, and the Electricity Retail Data Service. So these are kind of CSS providers that will now have oversight of their performance through the Performance Assurance Board. The second new responsibility is to do with a new appeal route that comes through from the Switching Change Advisory Board, so the CAB. So I'll try and not get the CAB and the PAB mixed up, but this is really just to draw out that there's a new appeal route, and this relates to operational changes. So if agreement cannot be reached on an operational change, there is the option for relevant organisations to appeal that to the PAB. Now, the thing I would draw out here is in the switching CAB terms of reference, there are a lot of provisions to try and avoid a situation where they would need to not disagree and there would be a need for an appeal. So there's a lot in there that around the switching CAB's authority to arbitrate and also grant temporary derogations against service levels if agreement can't be reached and more time is needed to resolve those. So we do anticipate that that's kind of a last resort, but of course there is provision in place if that is needed to come through to the PAB for decision. And the only other thing I'd really call out here is that we're in the process at the moment of making updates to our PAB terms of reference in order to facilitate this appeal route. So it does things like making sure that we can hold extraordinary PAB meetings a bit more quickly in the specific instances of emergency operational change appeal decisions, and also means that the quoracy arrangements have changed slightly in those occasions as well. And that's really just to facilitate the ability for those decisions to take place should they be needed to. So that's everything I was going to cover. I think we're moving on now to the Q&A section. So I'll hand back to Rebecca and Millie.
Hello, thank you everyone. Millie, I know there's a couple of questions come through Slido, but maybe what we can do first is go to anyone with their hands up. I know Paul Bedford had his hand up. So Paul, do you have a question you want to raise?
Yes, it was regarding the requirements for existing REC parties. You know, the speaker went through that at a rate of knots, and I wasn't able to keep track of it. I obviously we're going to get the slide back, but it would be useful to know in a nutshell if you're an existing REC party already exceeded. Do we need to do any new agreements, for instance, for the GES or for any other aspects if we're already exceeded to the REC? Just to clarify that.
Georgina or Anton, are you able to answer this one?
Hello, Paul. I'll do my best, but let's make it a bit of a conversation if I don't cover everything. So at CSS Go Live, being an acceded party kind of enables you for the gas inquiry service and the CSS. The CSS has one extra thing, which is to have a qualification to use it. You need to have gone through the user entry, the UEPT testing. So if your organization has gone through that, you will essentially come across to us as a party who is qualified. There are some parties out there who haven't, and they effectively need to do the same thing in the live market to access CSS. But if you've completed UEPT and you are already a party, you're ready to use CSS from Go Live, and you'll be ready to use GES under the REC from Go Live. Paul, is that the information that you needed? Was there something else?
It's extremely helpful. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Millie, should we go through some of the questions on Slido, please?
Yeah, so I think there was one, it was linked to, it was on the park slide. Someone raised, would we need to report all data cleanse exemptions every month, or just the new exemptions identified since the previous month's submission?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, for that question. So we were minded to assume that you would provide them monthly, as happens today to the DWG, as I understand that process. So effectively, you kind of refresh the full list every time. You know, obviously there is an alternative option to sort of say, well, we'll just get, you know, sort of we go for an incremental approach, particularly given we've got it at that meter point level. We obviously can, you know, build up the portfolio as opposed to kind of an incremental number. I think we could work with either. We'd assumed the former just because that's the existing process, and obviously we're sort of seeking to minimise change for people. If you've got a strong view around that, and you sort of go, actually, it'd be a lot easier to just give you the increment. You know, either sort of speak up now if you like, or a good opportunity to provide that feedback would be in the consultation. And if we see a strong, you know, kind of a minded to from parties to say they'd much prefer that approach, you know, we'd be happy to sort of clarify that in the guidance as part of obviously responding to the consultation. So we should, you know, as I say, we've kind of assumed monthly at the moment. I just actually had a look because I saw your question come in. We could probably strengthen that guidance just to make that super clear. So we'll take that feedback away. But as I say, if actually we got a lot of consultation responses saying, do you know what, it would make our life loads easier if we could just give you the delta, you know, that would be fine, because as I say, one of the things we're looking at is by having that meter point level detail, we can then sort of say, well, some of those exemptions clearly survive forever. Some of them, you know, there will become a point, you know, there are exemptions, I think, around, for example, you've taken all reasonable efforts to contact the customer. There becomes a point when, you know, almost you sort of say, well, you tried that, you know, a year ago, maybe that exemption sort of has expired, and maybe some more efforts need to be made, for example. So, you know, that's the sort of thing we're sort of thinking about there. So yeah, let us know your thoughts, and we'll sort of try and take a collective view based on the consultation responses.
Okay, there's just another question linking to park, so I'll just go on to that.
Just saw from Rachel there. Yeah. Sorry, does everybody see this, or do you want me to just read it out for the benefit of? Yeah,
not everybody. So yeah, if you want to read it out.
So Rachel's question was around the GS service provider. So Rachel, in the version that came out for impact assessment, we actually hadn't included this, and it was something that came back from some feedback on the impact assessment. So it's the service level reporting we've already been talking to each of the various providers, including the GS provider, around. So it's not something new. What we're just doing is saying, actually, let's just have that in the park as well. So there's one place that you can see that. So it's not a new requirement. It's the existing performance, sort of service level performance metrics that we've already been talking to the GS provider around. We're just going to consolidate that into the document. I literally, after this call, my next thing is to review a sort of a kind of a red line, because we've already used red, so I think we're having a blue lined version of the part with those additional changes, and then that will go out as part of the consultation next week. So you'll have a chance to have a look at that. I hope that answers the question, Rachel, but shout out if it doesn't. I've just seen a little thumbs up come out, so hopefully that was good news.
And there's just one more that's just come in. So it says, have you made any changes to the park since the impact assessment consultation has been reviewed?
So we're just working through that at the moment. As I say, one change is to include those service provider points, and we're just obviously looking at the other things. And there'll be somebody will keep me honest here on the right terminology, but I think it's a PRC document that comes out next with the details of that. So that'll all be coming out, and everybody can see that early next week. So we're just working through that at the moment. But it would only be changes in the sense of things from the impact assessment, if you like. We've not sort of dreamed up another data or anything like that since then, if that's where the question was directed.
And there's just one more, and so regarding the maintenance of qualification external assessment form, when does this new form go live?
So I think there are two potential ways of interpreting this. I'm just going to answer both. And again, whoever anonymous is, please, well, unless you want to stay anonymous, please just shout if I haven't been clear enough. So we've made small changes to the maintenance of qualification form to include CSS specific items. They're not massive. There are a few extra lines, and this is for CSS users only. When you look at it, it will be very similar to the document that we saw before. In fact, we started with the same document, added a few lines and tweaked some terminology. That will be out shortly. Is going to the PAB on Tuesday, and then I think after that step, unless they want us to tweak it further, we'll just be going through the issuing process, which would take days to weeks, not weeks to months. One of the next things that we will be doing, and this is mainly because we think PDFs are quite hard and a bit of a hassle, will be digitizing this so it is available on the REC portal, and that is one of the next priorities in the next tranche of REC portal work. So that would be happening not in days to weeks, but in kind of weeks to months. No need to de-anonymize yourself, but hopefully that covered that question.
Yeah, Anton, just to add to that, actually. So you may have all seen, but on the REC portal, there's a page, I think it's the release page, where it shows all the REC version 3 documents. So some are going to be the updated schedules, but there's also category 3 documents, which are going on there as well. So once we've gone through the PAB process next week, we can also get the PDF version of those forms uploaded there as well for visibility. Okay.
Perfect, thank you. I think that's it, yeah, on Slido at the moment.
Does anyone have any further questions they want to ask in terms of the first part of this webinar, or raise your hand before we move on to the next section?
Another question just has come into Slido. So it says, can I ask, if I submit my maintenance of qualification before CSS changes, will my evidence still be valid? I'm planning to submit next week.
I'll do this one. Yes. So if we asked you to do it, let's say we asked you to do it in May or June, or even before, it could have been April, couldn't it? That ticks your box for maintenance of qualification until the next year. So in the next year, if CSS is relevant to you, that new form will apply at that point. We don't want to get to the point where everyone who's done it in the last however many months needs to redo it. So if you fill in the form that you've been asked, you won't be asked any specific questions on CSS at this point, and assuming all the information's right, that's that job done.
Okay, thank you.
Lovely. I think that's all for questions now. What we'll do now is we'll move on to the next section, which is threshold setting, which is going to be led by Anton. But again, if you've got any questions in relation to CSS and performance assurance service, then please do continue to raise these, because we will have another Q&A session a bit later on. Over to you, Anton.
So perhaps I should have introduced myself before answering questions. My name's Anton, and I'm the director who leads the performance assurance service. So I'm heavily involved in lots of the things we do, and I really wanted to talk to you today about monitoring thresholds, because I think there's a real chance these are confusing or misunderstood. So we wanted to be transparent about the things we're doing and why and how. I really think this could be confusing. So hopefully I'll be clear, but questions are, invited, please ask if they're not clear. So if we just move on to just talk about why we need to do this. So we are taking quite a different approach to things to other organizations. So we're looking at a continuous monitoring approach where we look at data, and we've taken events that happen in lots of different data streams and we've turned them into metrics. Now the metrics often are things like, I don't know, 0.02 or 1.37. They are events turned into a metric that we can use. We then look at these metrics and determine performance assurance interventions. But because we've mapped them to this particular scale, it can be quite hard to differentiate which is worse and which is better. So something with a higher number, higher is worse in this case, can be not as much a concern as something with a lower number. And that the example I keep giving for this is, inappropriately disconnecting 1,000 vulnerable customers would be a massive concern. It's not the same as 1,000 address updates that are 1 day late, but if you just look at the raw numbers, they're both 1,000. So because of this, we need some way to differentiate between these. Given we have lots of metrics, it can't really just be, in the example I gave, we all know which one of those is most important, but it can't be based on that. It can't be subjective. So we need some ways of picking the priorities and thinking about where to focus our time, and that's the purpose of the thresholds. So what we do with this information is we look at people's performance, and we're looking for trends in the data that might suggest problems. If someone is over a threshold, we think that suggests a problem, but we also could find some strange behavior in the data that might suggest there's a problem, but it didn't meet the threshold criteria. So we're looking for unusual, unexplained, rapidly worsening performance. So these thresholds, they're really about the behavior of the PAB and the code manager. They help us make much more efficient decisions, and maybe they're a bit like in your business a delegated authority framework, where the PAB are telling us if these criteria are met, go off and work out what to do instead of always coming back and waiting for us. This should make us more efficient, easier to talk to the PAB about things, and a bit quicker to resolve certain things. I think the key point here is that thresholds help us tell the difference between things, and it's not just those 1,000 inappropriate disconnections or 1,000 address updates. A really clear example that would be flagged up by the use of thresholds is the recent DTN outage. We had lots of questions, and I totally understand why, where people said the DTN was down, I needed to send my flow at that time to meet my SLA. I couldn't. That is not my performance, and that makes sense. If you have a threshold, it is really obvious to see where the whole market moves or where an individual party moves, and they help us try and tell the difference between those type of things. So I think that's a bit of an overview. I wanted to then go into just some examples of how we use these thresholds to put some color on it. So if we can move to the next slide. So we have created 3 thresholds that are kind of applied. We might call that one threshold over a metric. And this is all set out in the performance assurance methodology. So this isn't new. This is something we put out and we consulted on. Gosh, it feels like about a year ago, but certainly before go live. And the 3 thresholds have different purposes. So the first one's the easiest to get your head around, a minimum activity level. There are times where we've seen in the data 100% issue rates. And the reason there's a 100% issue rate, perhaps, is a supplier who had one switch that was erroneous. Now that is not the most significant issue in the market, but if you only look at the rates, it stands out at the top. So we have a concept of a minimum activity level to make sure that we focus on the key areas and we don't get confused by the kind of law of small numbers. So a minimum activity level would be the minimum number of processes below which we would not automatically intervene. So we'd still probably look at these numbers in case, you know, there was an anomaly or something strange, but we wouldn't automatically intervene. The next one is a trend period. We look at most risk drivers monthly. That's how we consume the data. But the kind of sustained performance timeline just probably varies depending on the nature of the metric. So we should probably look at some areas where there's sustained performance over 3 months or 6 months. And if there's sustained underperformance, then that's the place to get involved. In other areas, we might want to be more reactive. So for example, around CSS Go Live, we probably want to act if something is changing significantly in 1 month, because it might be that CSS Go Live has caused everybody a problem and we would want to know about that and just understand it. So that's the trend period. It's the period over which we assess these scores, and it kind of tunes our sensitivity, our reactivity. The last one, in many ways, is quite straightforward. We've turned events into metrics, and we kind of need a way of thinking about where's the line. We call this our baseline performance expectation. This is set by the PAB, but for example, erroneous switches is quite an easy one to get your head around. We calculate the number of erroneous switches over total switches, and that is a metric, and we can set a number there. So maybe 1% is the kind of number you might think of there. That's the kind of purpose of that. I think talking about it helps, but I think trying to show you how we might use this and how we think about it is really important. So they're the kind of next few things that I'm going to do. So if we can move on. So how do we use these? We don't use them like a bit of wiggle room for people for a bit of error rate. That's not really what we're doing. People often talk to us about speed limits as quite an analogy for what we do. I don't think for thresholds it's a good analogy at all. So I think we all know, and I'm not a police officer, I can't tell you if this is true, well, maybe it's an urban legend, that there is a bit of wiggle room in the way that speed cameras are configured, and maybe if you go 51 through a 50, maybe you'll be okay. I don't know, I couldn't speak to that. You can see that wiggle room as being something sensible that they might apply. That's not really how we're thinking about our thresholds. It's quite different. It's about our activity. So I wanted to show you an example of that. We've put two graphs on the screen with fundamentally two distributions of performance that are very similar. So if we take the bottom left one first, just for the purpose of this argument, if you're further to the right, then you are performing worse, and the number of parties is just an indicative count. So this is indicative data. In this, we are presuming we set an expectation where the majority of organisations are below that, and a small number of organisations aren't. So if the PAB set this expectation, that would probably say to us, these outliers on the right probably are performing differently to everybody else. Perhaps there's something in the way that they are performing that needs to change. If we saw this and you know all the other thresholds were met, we would probably, as our first action, go and ask those individual organisations, did you know about this? Are you doing anything to address it? Is there something externally that's caused this for you? This would be our first performance assurance technique, which is clarifying. Sometimes we also start discussing, does this data that we have seen over the network, does this ring true for you? because we want to make sure that before we, kind of progress, that we're working all on the same solid fact base. Now, I've put that on the screen because that is how I think people mostly think about our behaviour, and it is a behaviour that we do. This is something that we do, but it's not the only way we behave. The one on the right is effectively the same shape graph, but we would interpret very, very differently. So the expectation there is significantly different to all of the performers in the market. This suggests that it's not, the cause probably isn't in an individual organisation. It's probably elsewhere. This is the kind of shape graph we would expect if there were persistent DTN outages. We would expect everybody to start struggling to perform, and some obviously would find it easier than others, perhaps because of the kind of requests in their business model, but everybody would struggle if the DTN was intermittent. So our expectation allows us to differentiate between the two and choose a more intelligent action than always expecting the problem to be with the party that is measured. That's a really key point. That's a really key point here. Being over threshold suggests that there is a problem. The code manager then needs to work out if the data suggests the problem is with a specific party, whether it is with a system, whether it is with a process, whether it's a data, whether it's something that might show up in that party but be caused by another party. This is complicated and nuanced. This isn't as simple as if you're over 51 miles an hour, that's a problem. But using threshold should help us do that. Okay, I wanted to move on to another slide. We're also aware that life isn't as easy in practice as it is in the theory of the code. There are going to be times when people have blips. There definitely are. We all have it in our business where someone key goes off sick, or there is a system outage, or one of your suppliers has an issue and that affects something and it's out of your control, or a supplier agent or something. We need to be, as a code manager, able to differentiate between things like that the party is empowered and expected to address, and things that are a bit more complicated and might need the code manager involved. Our timeline trend period idea is fundamentally for this. It is fundamentally a control to prevent the code manager going off on every single blip of data and asking lots of queries and generating lots of work when actually parties are empowered to address these problems without our intervention. So hopefully we've got a clear example that shows how this thought process would work. So the key thing here is the trend period, and we've drawn an indicative graph. And in this one, along the bottom are the months. So this is a timeline, so this isn't like the graph before. So as we go to the right, we're heading towards the future. And as we go up, people are scoring higher on the metric, and higher in this instance is bad. We have plotted a red line, which is our indicative performance expectation, that threshold that we set. But we've also plotted some coloured lines, which are the performance of organisations. And when we look at different metrics, we typically do see that there's a bit of movement month to month in all organisations, and that there are organisations at different levels and with different volatilities. So there are 4 parties mapped on there. Our trend period is trying to help us differentiate between the green and the purple. So the 2 lower ones, the yellow and blue, they would be under the threshold. They look like there's variation, and they look like they're addressing the problems that they have. The green one is consistently above that threshold. Now, if they have been above the threshold for 3 months, in this instance, this was a metric with a 3-month trend period, that is when we would start, asking them a question, understanding what's causing this, perhaps moving through those techniques. We want to differentiate here between these and the purple party. The purple party has clearly had something go wrong in month 4. their performance has gone significantly wrong. And in the data, we cannot tell you if that is because someone has got sick or, you know, all of those different unexpected events happen. But what we can tell you is in month 5 and month 6, they've gone and solved that problem. That is the behavior that we expect of parties. And because of that, you know, improvement, we wouldn't in this instance with a 3-month trend period look to intervene. We'd obviously keep track of the data and see if this happens again, but our trend period is to protect people around those blips. So the first key point is people are going to have blips. We're much more interested in understanding the causes of sustained underperformance. The second one, perhaps I haven't covered this quite as well as I could, is about the human review process. We set thresholds with the PAB. The PAB and us do our best to understand what will happen in the market. But let's be honest, I could not have predicted what happened to wholesale sale prices and the significant changes to market conditions that have resulted. If I could, I would probably be in the Bahamas or something, as working as an options trader or something, and very, very wealthy. Sadly, I'm not very wealthy. So because of this, we might set some thresholds that, with the best of intent, capture what we expect to happen, but that is not what happens. Because of that, we need to do a couple of things. We need to be flexible. If our thresholds, the data clearly shows, are wrong, discuss again with the PAB and say, look, this is clearly wrong. Let's move it up, let's move it down, whatever that is. But I think more importantly than that, we need real people, and real people are the people on this call that have been presented, looking at the data, understanding what's going on, and just saying, well, we didn't expect this, but there's a real anomaly here. For example, let's have a really simple example. If we have a trend period of 3, but everybody fails that metric 100% of time in 1 month, we are going to say to the PAB, hey, look, something has really gone wrong across the market. Something needs to happen. Now, the PAB does not empower us to immediately just go off and, you know, go and intervene there. We need to talk to the PAB about these things, discuss and agree an action plan, and those are actions for us to take. So you are protected from I don't know, our behaviours are controlled and sensibly managed. However, the PAB has the power, if they see an anomaly, to say, Anton, can you and your team go look into that? And we think that's proportionate. So that's how those metrics will be used. Maybe if we just move on to the next slide. I think we need to start looking forward, because this is all methodological stuff. Everything we said has been said, maybe in a different way in the mobilization of REC. We're now at the point where we have lots of data and we can set thresholds. We can't really, I think, set thresholds in a kind of finger in the air type way. We do need to use real market performance. We set thresholds only on areas we use data. So this seems very obvious when I say it, but we don't set them for all of our risks. There are some risks we use other approaches, the priority services register being the most obvious. We don't want to monitor and all the data, all the little changes, and seems like a security and privacy risk to us. Instead, we look at controls and we look at evidence, maintenance of qualification similarly. We look at evidence. So we don't do it everywhere, but where we do it, we look to set thresholds. We only set them when there's a track record, and there's some obvious stuff. There's some very CSS specific stuff. We're not setting that yet. We will wait until we have a track record of data. So what does that leave? It leaves a number of risk drivers where we have been working with the PAB to set these thresholds. They haven't been finalised yet, but the kind of areas they are, and we can send more detail if it's helpful, but it is fundamentally the risk register, switch meter readings, address management data, dealing with switch issues, dealing with inaccurate data in the market and erroneous switches, which I hope would all be things that you would expect the REC PAB to be focusing on. There are some proposed thresholds, and the PAB are working through this on Tuesday. to understand if these are exactly in the right areas or if they need to be tweaked or adjusted at all. So I think the next slide is another forward look. So what's the future look like? What's a high level summary and the final few points? Thresholds are there to make sure we focus in the right place. And I just really want to stress this. They're not really a target. They're not really focused on that individual party. They're definitely not a speed limit. They're there to help us tell between the whole market, individual organizations that should be left to manage this performance themselves. A really important point, I imagine one of the questions that will come is, how do we see this? How do we make sense of this? Dashboards are being developed so that you can see your own performance. We think given these thresholds are mapped numbers, they're quite hard to understand without the real data. So we want to show every party the same information that we look at on them. So if you are mem X or supplier Y, you will see essentially the same view that we have, but with everybody else's information removed. So what your performance is, what the data that we see on you. We think it's really important that happens. I think when you see those, thresholds will make sense because you can see your relative performance next to them. So we do commit that when dashboards are ready, that we will share more information on thresholds. There is a live discussion on the PAB about the right way to do this. So whether it's all of the numerical thresholds, whether it's what the PAB's approach is to each risk driver, maybe it's only some bits. I don't think we've really worked through all that. For me personally, I think it's really important that we do two things, that we are transparent and we are not overly complicated. I think they're the two things that I will be pushing for us to achieve. The last thing, and this is really important, these thresholds are not static. We've seen significant changes in all parts of the market in the last 2 years. There probably will be significant changes to come. I don't have a crystal ball to know what they are. So we will probably tighten or relax some things. We might find that CSS really makes things easier for everybody and performance is immediately improved. If that's the case, we will change our thresholds. I guess the key point I want to make in all of this is that last point on the slide. We want thresholds to help address some really important issues for consumers, help us tell the difference between things that parties should address and things that need to be resolved elsewhere. We know it's nuanced. We're trying really hard to be open about it and clear. I do think because it's nuanced, it's quite hard to be clear, but hopefully we've done that and hopefully we'll continue to do that. So I think that's all I had prepared to talk about. I'm sure that there will be some questions on this.
Thank you, Anton. Very helpful. Millie, have we got any questions on Slido?
Yeah, there's just one that's just come through now. Will the dashboards be in the portal? Could they have other parties' trend lines in but anonymised?
So we've thought about that and I'll tell you where we are, but I think it's a good question. So the dashboards will be accessed through the REC portal. That is both, like the design is that the REC portal, that's the key place, one place to access things, and that's where you'll see yours. We don't plan on putting other parties' trend lines on each of the dashboards. Instead, we do that in a kind of controlled way. So we call something where we do that you've described a peer comparison. So for all metrics, we plan on sharing you, Carl, your information, and where we think it's useful to share extra information, like either anonymized or unanonymized, it really depends on the information, doesn't it? Then we will publish that on the portal through effectively another part of the dashboard. So if I give you two examples where they plan on taking place, one is erroneous switches. You know that we publish a regular erroneous switch peer comparison. That will be in the dashboard and effectively be the thing that you say just on this really important topic. Another example is the SMIS survey. That is effectively very similar to a peer comparison, and we published that. We're in an active discussion with PAB about which things should be peer comparisons and which things shouldn't, which things either provide meaningful information and incentives and which things don't. Our current decision is those two. I think what I've realised from Carl's question is, as we progress and the dashboards are available, we should reflect upon that information need and review it. When we're reviewing our annual plan, I think something we really should do is think about which areas are peer comparisons and which areas are just on yourself. Carl, feel free to turn this into a conversation if I haven't answered it properly. Okay, cool. That was a relief. Are there any other questions?
Nothing that's come in as of yet, but I didn't know if anybody wanted to raise any questions verbally or via the chat. Oh, no, one's just come in, sorry. So someone says, sorry, I may have missed this, but what are the timescales for the dashboards being published on the portal?
I don't think you've missed it. What I understand, and I've got colleagues who's just jumped on it, but perhaps might jump in. What I understand is that the dashboards are the REC Portals development team, one of their next priorities. And you know, I spoke in that it's not days to weeks, it's more weeks to months. It'll probably take a number of months is the steer that I would give you. The thing that I can commit from our team is that once they are ready, and in fact probably just before, we will provide a session that's similar to this that helps you understand what they mean and how to navigate them, and you know, has an opportunity for you to ask questions. Was there anything anyone else in my team or our team wanted to add?
I think that was I was just coming in case Anton you needed, but I think you've covered it. It's a key priority. I know REC are just looking at you know, making sure the right solution is picked that meets stakeholders' needs, but it's expected to deliver over the next quarter in terms of that sort of timescale. So you know, we're really keen. You know, REC are really keen. You know, the co-managers are really keen. You guys, I think, are all keen to have it. It's you know, sort of all this needs to sort of come together. But we think you know, as well as for all the transparency reasons you've mentioned, Anton, also, you know, we've seen and we've had parties, you know, kind of raise this to us. You just seeing what we see is also actually a really good way of just encouraging that performance uplift as well. You know, it's obviously always helpful to know kind of how you're doing, and sometimes it can reveal something that you weren't aware was a problem, and people will just take their own action. And you know, if that's the case, and Anton can sit on his deck chair, maybe not in the Bahamas, but you know, we'll be very much come nearer to you, Anton, and you know, not have to intervene as much, then I'm sure you'll be very happy with that.